Picture this, the world, thousands of years ago, as civilizations began to take shape. Amidst the birth of culture, art, language, and trade, there was a darker undercurrent weaving its way through the tapestry of human history. This was the inception of slavery, a practice that would persist and evolve for millennia. In the cradle of civilization, ancient Mesopotamia, slavery was an accepted part of life. Here, people were enslaved as a consequence of debt or as a result of warfare. The Code of Hammurabi, one of the oldest deciphered writings of significant length, even had laws pertaining to the treatment of slaves. Moving down the Nile, we find the ancient Egyptians. Slavery was an integral part of their society, with slaves being used in construction, agriculture, and domestic work. But remember, in these times, slavery wasn't about race. It was about power, conquest, and debt. In the grand city-states of ancient Greece, slaves were used in every aspect of life. From mining to tutoring the young, slaves were seen as property, a commodity to be bought and sold. Then we have the Romans, whose society was heavily dependent on slavery. The Roman Empire, in its vast expansion, enslaved people from all corners of the known world. Slaves built their roads, fought in their arenas, and worked in their homes. But again, this was not about race. It was about conquest and control. Slavery was not unique to these cultures. It was practiced in various forms across the globe, from the Americas to Africa and Asia. It was a common thread in the fabric of human history, woven into the lives of countless individuals. As we move forward in time, we find that the face of slavery begins to morph, taking on new dimensions and complexities. But that's a story for another time. For now, let's remember that slavery, as abhorrent as it is, was not born from modern prejudices. It was a product of power dynamics, and it was as universal as the civilizations that practiced it. As we step into the Middle Ages, the practice of slavery takes on a different form. During this period, slavery transitioned from a system primarily based on conquest and debt to one deeply woven into the fabric of the global economy. The Middle Ages, spanning roughly from the 5th to the 15th centuries, encompassed a time of immense social, cultural, and economic transformation in Europe and beyond. One of the significant shifts in this era was the rise of the Arab slave trade. The Arab world, having vast geographical reach stretching from the Middle East to North Africa, became a significant player in the global slave trade. Slaves were taken from regions as diverse as Europe, Africa, and even Asia, and were used in a variety of roles, from domestic servants to soldiers. However, it was not just the Arab world that was involved in the practice of slavery during the Middle Ages. Europe too was a part of this system, with serfdom, a form of bonded labor, being prevalent. Serfs, although not slaves in the strictest sense, were tied to the land they worked on and were subject to the control of their lords. Yet, the most transformative aspect of slavery during the Middle Ages was the beginning of the African slave trade. This was a time when Africa, particularly West Africa, started to become a significant source of slaves for the rest of the world. Driven by economic demands and societal structures, these slaves were transported across vast oceans and continents, marking the inception of a brutal and inhumane system that would reach its peak in the following centuries. The Middle Ages was an era that saw the evolution of slavery from a localized practice to a global enterprise, deeply embedded within the world's economic systems. The Middle Ages set the stage for a new era of slavery, one that would forever mark the history of humanity. The 15th century saw the dawn of the transatlantic slave trade, a dark chapter in human history. As Europe began to explore and colonize the New World, a demand for labor in these new colonies ignited a trade that would forever mar our collective story. This was the transatlantic slave trade, a ruthless industry where human beings were reduced to commodities. The journey that these enslaved Africans endured was known as the Middle Passage. Shackled and packed like livestock into the bowels of ships, they faced horrifying conditions, with many not surviving the journey. The cramped quarters, lack of sanitation, and brutal treatment by the crew led to high mortality rates. Those who survived were sold in the Americas and the Caribbean, forced to work on plantations, in mines, and as domestic servants. Many nations were involved in this inhuman trade. Portugal and Spain, early pioneers of exploration, were the first to engage in the transatlantic slave trade. They were soon followed by other European powers, such as the Netherlands, France, and Britain. These nations built their wealth on the backs of enslaved Africans, reaping the profits of their labor. But what of the impact on Africa? The transatlantic slave trade depopulated vast regions of the continent. It devastated communities, disrupted economies, and led to long-lasting political instability. The mass exodus of people, particularly young and able-bodied men and women, created a void that severely hampered Africa's development and progress. Moreover, the slave trade fueled warfare and conflict among African societies. Some African leaders, seduced by the allure of European goods, participated in the trade, capturing their own people to sell to European slavers. As Europeans colonized the New World, the demand for labor led to the institutionalization of slavery. The establishment of slavery in the Americas was a gruesome chapter in human history, marked by inhumane conditions, brutal treatment, and unfathomable suffering. From the 16th to the 19th centuries, millions of African men, women, and children were forcibly transported across the Atlantic, their lives irrevocably altered by the chains of bondage. Plantations, the economic backbone of the colonies, were labor-intensive enterprises. Sugar, tobacco, coffee, and cotton required a surplus of hands to grow, harvest, and process. To meet this demand for labor, colonists turned to the enslavement of Africans. The plantations, often sprawling over vast territories, were sites of relentless work, harsh discipline, and brutal punishments. The enslaved lived in squalid conditions, their lives dictated by the whip and the bell. The economic impact of slavery in the colonies was profound. The wealth generated from the plantations flowed into European coffers, financing the growth of cities, industries, and empires. The colonies, particularly those in the Caribbean and the southern United States, became the engines of the global economy, their output of sugar, tobacco, and cotton feeding the world's growing appetite for these commodities. But the riches of the New World came at an unbearable human cost. The system of slavery was built on the fundamental denial of the humanity of the enslaved. The brutal treatment of the enslaved, the separation of families, and the relentless toil under the tropical sun were all integral parts of this system of exploitation. Slavery in the New World was a system built on exploitation and brutality, driven by economic gain. As the 18th century dawned, voices began to rise against the inhumanity of slavery. This marked the beginning of the abolition movements, a significant period in our history that saw brave men and women standing up against the atrocities of slavery in both Europe and America. In Europe, the abolition movement was gaining momentum, with Britain at the forefront. Enter William Wilberforce, a man whose name became synonymous with the fight against slavery. A member of the British Parliament, Wilberforce spent nearly half his life advocating for the end of the slave trade. His relentless lobbying led to the passage of the Slave Trade Act of 1807, which prohibited the slave trade within the British Empire. This was a significant victory, but it was just the beginning. Across the pond, in America, the abolition movement was also gathering steam. A key figure in this struggle was Frederick Douglass, a former slave who became a powerful voice for abolition. Douglass used his experiences to highlight the cruelty of slavery, advocating for its end through speeches, writings, and political activism. His autobiography, published in 1845, was a searing indictment of the institution of slavery and played a crucial role in changing public opinion. The abolition movement wasn't without its challenges. There was resistance, both from those who profited from the slave trade and those who feared societal change. Abolitionists were often met with hostility and violence, yet they persevered. They organized, they lobbied, and they fought, not with weapons, but with words and ideas. The abolition movements in Europe and America were a testament to the power of collective action and the indomitable human spirit. The 19th century brought the long-awaited end to slavery in many parts of the world. This era, filled with turmoil and transformation, witnessed the relentless struggle for freedom by those who had been shackled by the chains of slavery for centuries. In the United States, the abolitionist movement gained momentum, leading to the monumental American Civil War. Fought from 1861 to 1865, this bloody conflict was not just a war between the North and South, but a war for the soul of a nation. After years of bloodshed and devastation, the war concluded with the ratification of the 13th Amendment, marking the official end of slavery in the United States. Across the Atlantic, the United Kingdom had already abolished slavery in 1833, setting a precedent for other European nations. In Brazil, the last country in the Western world to do so, slavery was finally abolished in 1888, closing a dark chapter in human history. Slavery, a dark chapter in human history, has left an indelible mark on our world. From its origins, through the Middle Ages, to the transatlantic slave trade and its subsequent abolition, each phase has shaped societies and cultures in countless ways.